Dr. Bernard Blumenau, and he's a senior lecturer in international history and politics at the School of International Relations and the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. His research interests centre on the historical evolution of German foreign policy and the history of terrorism. And he's the author of the United Nations of Terrorism, Germany, Multilateralism and Anti-Terrorism Efforts in the 1970s. Please welcome Bernard to the podium.
I'm working mostly on German foreign policy, and I'm a historian, so talking about the future of Europe, the future of transatlantic relations is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I'll still try to come up with some reasonable thoughts, and we're amongst friends here anyway, so I think there's not too much of a risk. Let me start very briefly by just alluding to the challenges that Europe is facing at the moment, and I'm not going to go into any detail. A lot of these things have been mentioned before, but I think I just want to remind us of those before I talk a bit more about the future of these relationships. So, in terms of strategic environment, the world is changing, Europe's place in it is changing, the rules of the international system are changing, Europe has become quite comfortable with these rules and now has to adapt to the future. There are issues around the defense of Europe, territorial defense, that have to be addressed again, something that European countries could for a long time outsourced to the Americans. Now they have to handle that themselves. That also relates to issues about what is the future of defense, what's about hybrid warfare, how to protect strategic infrastructure, how to make decisions on that. The European decision-making process is often very cumbersome, so we might probably have to shift towards something that's more built around coalitions of the willings or qualified majority voting. Again, something that has been mentioned before, Europe is a huge market, so it does still have a lot of power in that sense, and that it has a lot of consumers that are able to pay a lot of money for goods that are produced around the world, and that gives it some regulatory power on some of these issues. The issue here is that a lot of the technology, for instance, that Europe is trying to regulate, AI, for instance, the European Union has done something on that, is not produced in Europe anymore. So they're trying to regulate something where they don't have a lot of control over the direction it is taking. China's another issue. And then technology, I've touched on that already, so there's a huge lag behind of Europe on key technologies. That's AI, but also thinking about all the big platforms you're using, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Apple, credit cards. It's all something that's not directly controlled by European companies. And then European unity. It's fragile, there's a lot happening, there's a lot of polarization happening. We've seen the outcome of the elections in the UK yesterday. The AfD is now, in some polls at least, the leading opposition party in Germany. France might have a president of a different political direction as of next year. So these issues obviously relate to the kind of direction European countries want the continent to take, but also the questions around cooperation, decision-making, and unity. And without unity, I think it is very difficult, it will be very difficult for Europeans to play any serious part in the future. So these 5 challenges taken together force 2 questions that Europe has been able to avoid for some time in the past. The first is strategic orientation. So for 70 years, Europe didn't really have to make a choice. The US security umbrella, the open trading order, and the rules-based system all pointed in the same direction, and European interests broadly aligned with American ones. And that alignment is gone. Europe now has to decide, issue by issue, which partners to work with, sometimes the United States, sometimes China, other countries in the BRIC or the G20, for instance. So this is a fundamentally different way of doing foreign policy, and Europe is not yet institutionally or culturally ready for it. The second question is, who leads this process? So strategic autonomy doesn't build itself, someone has to drive it politically, institutionally, and financially. And here the picture is generally open. And that brings me to the second question about the current state and future of the relationship. So the questions I've been asked to address are the obvious ones. But before answering them, I want to push back on something that they all assume. They assume that the UK sits between roughly 2 comparable options. One is the EU on one side, the other one is the US, and it's making a choice between friends. And I think this framing really does not belong to 2026 anymore. What the UK actually faces today is something quite different. It's one large neighbor and a partner that is increasingly hostile to both of them, both the UK and Europe. And let me unpack that a little bit more, because the rest I want to say flows from that. The EU is not a foreign policy choice for the UK in the way that the United States is. It's 27 democracies on the UK's doorstep, sharing the same continent, the same trade interconnections, the same security parameter, the same energy grid, the same Russian threat, the same migration pressures, the same climate exposure, and the same political polarization and growth of the political fringes. They also share an extremely dense cultural, social, and family network. So the channel is not the Atlantic. 45% of UK goods exports still go to the European Union, more than half of the imports to the UK come from the EU, and British and European militaries train together, plan together, and increasingly procure together as well. UK regulators and EU regulators look at the same problems and reach broadly the same answers because they are responding to the same underlying realities. So this is not a relationship, and we've heard that before, that the UK can opt out in any meaningful sense. The only questions are whether it is managed well or badly, and what lessons the UK takes from this extremely intimate relationship. Will it seek further integration, or will it continue down the erroneous path that Brexit has set it on? The United States, by contrast, has never been a neighbor. It's been an ally, and from 1945 until very recently, a fairly generous and reliable one. But over the last 15 months or so, things have been looking quite differently. The US, and we've heard that before, has threatened the territory of a NATO ally in Greenland and has called into question time and again the commitment to NATO and to the NATO defense clause altogether. It has imposed punitive tariffs on European goods. Trump has humiliated European leaders and employed bullying tactics that probably would have seen him suspended from school. Moreover, the US is now openly interfering in the domestic affairs of allied countries in Europe at a level we've not seen before to that extent. And they openly side with extreme and extremist parties. And let me just reiterate the 2025 National Security Strategy, which explicitly aligned Washington with what it calls patriotic European parties, the far-right anti-European forces that are challenging the mainstream democratic governments of many allied nations across the continent. And just a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, the Vice President went to Munich and lectured European leaders that the real threat to Europe came from inside its own institutions and not from Russia. American billionaires, I don't need to mention any names, have intervened directly in German and British elections. American social media platforms are amplifying particular political voices in Europe. So this is not the behavior of a friendly ally. This is the behavior of a power that has decided that European democracies, as they currently exist, and the political autonomy of the continent, and I explicitly include the UK here, are an obstacle to American interest. And let me reiterate, this hostility is directed not just at the EU, it is directed at the UK as well. Trump did not exempt Britain from the tariffs. The interventions in British politics have been just as aggressive as the ones in Germany and elsewhere. Trump has mocked the British Prime Minister just as he has mocked British soldiers who fought and died in Afghanistan alongside American soldiers. So the UK certainly does not get a special pass. And it's not just Trump. We've heard that before from the other speakers. There are underlying issues just that Trump is only amplifying. So the transatlantic alliance, as we traditionally understood, is effectively over, and Europe and the UK have to deal with the United States that is at best transactional and at worst adversarial for the foreseeable future. So when the question is asked whether the UK can look both ways, I think the honest answer is that both is no longer two equivalent options. One is a permanent geographic, economic, political, and strategic reality. The other is a partner whose interests now diverge from Europe on many issues and who, in some ways, is actively working against Europe. That does not mean that the UK, or Europe as a whole, have to turn their back entirely on the United States. I think that's something we've heard before as well. And it shouldn't, that would be foolish. There's real common ground. It's economic, financial, scientific, cultural, and social ties. And I think it is important to stress that Trump is not America. So many personal relationships remain strong and will continue to last, binding Europe to the United States in layers and with a strength that is far harder to destroy than political and diplomatic relations, and far less dependent on the day-to-day business of politics. And I think these bonds will matter for decades to come. In terms of global politics and security, there will continue to be overlap too, although arguably there will be more diversion and fraction. And the Iran war has just demonstrated that. And I believe that future US administrations, I think I agree with others here as well, will be easier to deal with. So the relationship, the transatlantic relationship is over. It's not over, but it is transformed. And still, they can work together on certain issues in the future. So given that the UK shares a continent with a major democratic bloc and shares a hostile environment with that bloc, how does it organize its relationship with that neighbor and the priority, and how does it in turn shape the transatlantic relationship? And I think this is a matter of Europe first. Also, because strategically planning a relationship with a highly volatile and moody Trump is near impossible. There are only so many state visits by the king, and whether the British or the American, that tend paper over these ruptures that are emerging all the time. And this is the kind of question, how that future relationship will look like, that I want to focus for the rest of my talk. So let me now answer the first questions. The EU and US relations are heading for a long and structural cooling. I think that's nothing new here. We've heard it before. Greenland, Article 5, all these other issues have been mentioned before. The US is probably also becoming more inward-looking, almost exactly 100 years after it did so previously, and it is definitely shifting its attention away from Europe towards Asia. And this means that the Europeans have to look more after their own neighborhood. Again, that's not something entirely new. Bush Senior's call for partnership and leadership was basically going for the same direction, and this is a call that has been made by American governments previously as well. But I think what is different now that the rhetorics have changed. So this kind of packaging many conflicts still in the language of cooperation, of partnership and alliance, that is over, and that is over, and that has changed with Trump. So we will see a more layered relationship on a case-by-case basis in the future. There will be cooperation where interests generally overlap, perhaps on intelligence sharing, perhaps on some aspects of trade, perhaps even on dealing with China as a competitor, but there will be a lot of friction elsewhere. And this means that Europe has to de-risk from the US, just as it has to do that from China. We're looking at a pragmatic business relationship, but no longer an alliance. And in that sense, it will be the same with Europe's relationship with many other key powers, whether it's China or BRICS. So we're heading towards a world where ad hoc cooperation is a prevalent form of multilateralism, I believe, rather than firm alliances. For the European-American relationship, this means Europe really enforcing its own autonomy as far as possible. But that's not just a consequence of the Trump administration's policies, even though they have demonstrated how important that is. It's also a lesson we've learned from previous crises, whether it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the current blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, or we might see something again if China escalates its tension with Taiwan. All of this means that Europe has to become more independent. So strategic autonomy, I believe, is a logical consequence here. Building up European champions that can compete with American and Chinese companies in fields like AI is a matter of logic, and European countries improving their green energy capacities to decouple themselves from the massive dependency on imported gas and oil and the economic repercussions supply crisis can create, as we are seeing currently. I think we are needing more diversification of supplies of critical raw materials and more European weapons platforms that can remove the potential for foreign actors to have a say on their use, either through political interventions, kill switches, or the withholding of spare parts. European autonomy when it comes to weapon systems of the future is also something very important. Methods of drones, possibly robots, the Chinese are catching a lot on there. And of course we also have to look towards space. So in essence that means that Europe will have to do more of its own, but that also applies to other fields like food, production of food, and the ingredients needed for the production of food such as fertilizers. Medicines will have to be produced here more as well. Industrial facilities able to produce steel and other key components will have to be maintained, and I think that decision by the British government was a very smart one. And these are just some examples. Others include, as I've mentioned before, European equivalents to critical platforms, and also doubting whether American companies, for instance, should handle the critical and sensitive European data that they're doing at the moment. So in essence, we have to go back to innovating, designing, building and stockpiling in Europe again. It's not an easy solution, it's not a quick one, but I think it is one that has to be done anyway. And this brings us to the question who should do it, and maybe even more importantly, who should take the leadership and perhaps also who has to pay for that. And the question and the answer here is depends. Certain European members, the UK, France, possibly Germany and Poland, can lead on security issues. If you include defense cooperation and procurement, I think Germany definitely will have to be part of that. When it comes to promoting European solutions to technological problems, the European Commission might play a bigger role through blue sky funding, increased research budgets and support for startups so that they can scale up quickly, and perhaps in the form of something similar to Horizon, where non-EU members such as Switzerland, Australia, Canada and the UK can contribute and benefit as well. And that leads us to the bigger questions: who has to pay for that? It will be expensive, and in times of squeezed budgets everywhere, this is a very difficult question to answer. In all likelihood, taxes across Europe will have to go up, and this is a political conversation I think that European countries cannot avoid. So where does the UK fit into the picture? I think the old framing, we thought it before, that the UK was a bridge, the indispensable interpreter between Washington and Brussels, and the holder of a special relationship, all of this is over. The role assumed two ends of the bridge pointing more or less in the same direction, and that no longer exists, and the abyss that the bridge is supposed to span is getting larger and larger. And the UK risks of being caught between two hefty blocks has a fairly medium-sized power. It risks not being central to either side, but peripheral to both, and in the worst case, crash between them. So Starmer's notion of not choosing between the US and the EU is inherently outdated, I believe. In fact, there is no choice anymore. Trump has made that choice for the UK. The realistic option now is closer alignment with Europe on most issues, while perhaps, and where feasible, maintaining specific transactional links with Washington, intelligence cooperation and others. But I believe the clear priority here must be Europe. And this, as I said, implies a pragmatic transactional relationship with the United States. It's probably no longer the special relationship that Britain was romanticizing. It also implies further integration into Europe, and ideally I think I would like to see a re-entry into the European Union. I think some people here might agree with that, but that seems to be unfeasible at this point. Not least also because of European reservations. Many European member states have reservations about letting the UK back in, but also because of the prospect of a reform government in 2029. Just on a side note though, I mean, we might see, and I just try to be an eternal optimist here, many people had many reservations about Meloni when she took over in Italy, and yet she actually pursued a fairly pro-European path. But that really is just any kind of optimism I'm clinging on to. But the sooner London acknowledges and admits the new shape of its relationship with both of its most important partners, the better position it is in, and the sooner it will be able to act rather than just to react. So this brings me to the second question. Can the UK look to both, or must it choose? I've already preempted much of what I'm going to say. The question is wrongly phrased, but the choice points to it. The choice it points to is urgent and real. It's wrong because there are no equivalent options anymore. I've mentioned already issues of geography and so on. But the question points to a real choice, and that choice is being made every day, issue by issue. Starmer's refusal to back the US over Iran was a choice. The Kensington Treaty with Germany was a choice. Security and defense partnership with the EU was a choice. And talking about joining SAFE and Erasmus Plus and the youth experience scheme are choices. So each of them are small individual steps, but together they tell a clear story about where British interests actually lie and where the direction is headed. So the real question is not EU or US, it's whether the UK approaches these choices as a series of one-off transactions, hedging commitments, or as a coherent strategy direction leading back to Europe. And here the main constraint, of course, is domestic. The political constraint is reforms polling, the legacy of the 2016 referendum, and Labour's self-imposed red lines on the single market, customs unions, and free movement. But like I said before, EU member states are also reportedly skeptical about offers to the UK because they fear that Starmer might fall and there might be a reform government coming in 2029. And I think the risk is that this is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the cleanest way I can put it is Europe is a clear choice. It's a dictate of geography, trade, political alignment, social personal ties, and security. Now let me address the question regarding the long-term prospects for EU, US, and UK relations. And I think this is a question where the news is more positive than the headlines might suggest. The structural trajectory points one direction, and the speed and depth depends on the choices that haven't been made yet. The pull is real and durable, already discussed. The UK interests are largely the same as Europe's, and in a world of increased polarization and competition, the UK on its own can hardly stand its ground. It can, however, if it's part of Europe. And Europe also needs the UK. It has one of the most capable militaries. It's a nuclear power, the largest financial center in Europe, with historical links across the globe. Any European solution to the Ukraine crisis will have to involve the UK. It's one of the world's largest economy and has a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. So any serious European defense architecture would be much stronger with the UK in it. And that gives the UK some leverage. And it gives the EU members a reason to keep the door open despite the concerns. But on all accounts, the UK needs the EU at least as much and probably more. It needs it for trade, food supplies, for issues around migration and climate change, for putting up resistance to the US or China or others, and maybe most importantly, needs Europe for its own defense and security. Not just against a perhaps full-fledged military attack by Russia at the end of the decade, but also in an era of increased hybrid warfare with attacks on critical infrastructure, subsea cables, networks, and the like. So the UK can go into negotiations with the Europeans with some confidence, but it needs to be realistic about the leverage. So what's a realistic destination looking out to the 2030s? It's probably not re-entry. The politics on both sides, I think, won't allow that for the foreseeable future. It might be dynamic regulatory alignment, full participation in some strategic instruments, say, for instance, Horizon and others. So I think more kind of Switzerland plus option than full integration. And let me just give you a couple of concluding thoughts before my time is up. The transatlantic relationship is being remade, not destroyed, I think. There will be future US administrations easier to deal with than this one, and there will be ways of cooperation on specific issues, but the days when Washington was a stable pillar of European and British policies are gone, and I think the sooner European countries realize that the better, and it might actually help them shape their relationship with the Americans. And Europe's response to the second is the central question here, how it will be able to achieve consensus and majorities for changes is a big question, especially as a political setup is under threat, but we're having a window of opportunity here. I think it was mentioned Orban is gone, so for the time being, it is easier to build certain majorities for certain projects, and I think that is the choice that has to be made and the window that has to be chosen. So the choices between building a stronger Europe with the full involvement of the UK, or failing that, becoming a pawn on the global chessboard. And I think in that sense, it's not really a choice at all. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hello.
I'm really depressed because it seems to me that what you've been saying and what the panel has been saying is right, but what has been happening in the elections is negating what is being discussed in this room. So how do we create a political environment in the UK where the messages can be given more clearly to an electorate which is clearly or evidently not wanting to engage in these issues? And if we look at the situation, I haven't checked it in detail this morning, but I mean, if we think reform is number 2 in the country at the moment, what do we do? Is it the media that needs to step up? Is it because it's not going to be necessarily the politicians if the politicians with a voice are reformed.
I think one of the things that startled me from the very beginning is that when Starmer came in with that huge majority last year, what I believed he would have done is to seek quick further alignment and integration with Europe so that the results can be presented by the end of this parliament, and hopefully some of the people that voted for reform for various reasons, I don't know what the reasons are why people voted for that. I think economic decline and loss of prospects might have been one of these factors. Some of these effects of integrating better into the most important market might have come through by the time of the end of the parliament to get some people back. He did not do that. He imposed the red lines. He was scared of reform. I don't think that policy has worked out. To be honest, and again, I'm really just brainstorming here as well, but I think why people vote for reform might have many, many reasons, and few of them might actually be related directly to Europe. or the relationship with Europe. There might be a lot of protests in it, there might be a lot of local politics in it, there might be a lot of other factors that are playing into it. Unfortunately, it's all coming together in that one big conglomerate of reform, and they're very good, as many other populists, to exploit it. I'm afraid I can't give you a good answer, and I'm not sure I can cheer you up in any way here, but I think what is needed, the sooner the better, is more steps towards Europe to kind of ease some of the frictions, to perhaps benefit from some of the economic benefits that might come from it, hopefully before the election comes up. But it's not just a problem for the UK. I mean, I'm much more familiar with the German question. Even there, things are not looking very well. But what is interesting is that the Alternative for Germany, which was founded as a very anti-European integration movement ago, is not really talking about leaving the European Union as such anymore. It's talking about turning it back into a more kind of economic, cooperation-focused thing, and not so much one that has political integration. But I think if we are looking at one positive, and I'm really trying to find the silver linings in the landscape at the moment, but one is that the European project as such is maybe not as much under threat as we were thinking, and it might just be transformed but not altogether stopped. And I think Meloni is an interesting case to look at as well.
You touched on this idea that we have a moment. Orban's out, we might have a moment to be able to put into kind of some kind of policy that will make us stronger, say, geostrategically. Orban, Le Pen, reform, etc., etc., etc. Is there an inherent structural weakness in the way that politics in Europe in general structurally supports too much political diversity to be geopolitically strong? Is that the case? What can we do about it?
Again, I'm just thinking out of the blue here. I don't think that's a weakness as such. I think diversity, representation of different opinions is something that kind of has its benefits. It's been working in many European countries for the past decades. I'm from Germany. We're very used to coalition governments. We're not really used to one party being strong enough to lead. So it is a matter of compromising. I think what is the bigger problem here is the lack of leadership on some of these issues. So we would need someone in Europe or in European countries to really push forward towards some of these things to come. Macron tried it, but because of this lame duck situation in France, he's not really in a position. I was hoping, and I was seeing a little bit of that from the German Chancellor Merz, so I think amongst the European politicians at the moment is still in the best position to push for that. But even he is quite hesitant about it because of domestic constraints again, and because of focus domestically on other issues. Had the Strait of Hormuz not happened, I think we might have seen more there, because economic recovery was emerging there. Now it's all in doubt again, and I think it is all a matter of economic development as well, or economic prospects as well. So I think diversity, political diversity makes decisions more difficult, but doesn't make them necessarily worse. But I think we need leadership and coalition building capacities there. Yeah.
Does anybody want to make a quick 30-second
Yeah,
summation of what you're thinking?
I think the quick 30-second, both questions were great. They come down to the same thing really. Is are we going to see political leaders who are going to take this forward? And I suppose my one note of optimism in this is it can happen suddenly. Like we went into this tailspin probably about, someone said Brexit, maybe just before that. You can come out, political moments come, political moments go. We're waiting for maybe a new generation of leaders who are going to get this and show more awareness of the world that it is. So, I think that's the optimism. And you can't necessarily see it, just like we didn't see going into this tailspin. We're not necessarily now able to see how we come out of it. But, the history tells us that, that can happen.
Phil, do you want any final words from yourself?
The only positive is often when you have the national elections, the populists do less well than they poll. So the AfD or the National Front do really well in the polls, or even well in the early stages of an election. But often when you come to the final vote, they do less well. And that's, at least there's some sanity below the surface.
I think the main thing we learned is that Europe, the UK as part of Europe, Europe is a superpower. We are a superpower. We're an economic superpower. We can be a military superpower. In some ways, we are the superpower. We have things that other continents don't have. We have this hundreds of years of growth and history and culture, our education systems, the rule of law, which really is one of the key components of economic growth. And then just to address that lady, that made the point there about agency, what can we do? Because it did come up, didn't it, throughout this, that everything, unless we get a reform government, and I think what's clear to me after the last few days is that all that nonsense in Britain about our ridiculous voting system, creating stable government, the Labour Party, the Conservatives, we need to move beyond that. We need PR. You've got to remember, this is not anti-democratic. Anti-democratic is reform getting in, because they're going to get in on a minority. What we need is a system of politics, a system of voting that will allow us to elect the people that we want. And then reform will not get anywhere near power, because 70% of us don't want them near power. So I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, but we have power ourselves, and it's time for us to go out and speak to our electoral representatives about this, because it's a key point in Britain's history here. Where do we side? We all know where we want to go. The majority of British people know where we want to go. Can we live with getting a government that doesn't support that? No, we can't.